everybody wants to improve their sex life. I don't care how good it is, right? I mean, everybody wants to do that.
I would agree with
So
you.
how did you get into this particular arena?
So this book is an exploration into the science of sexual fantasies and desires, and that's something that's been of interest to me for a long time. I spent 10 years as a college sex educator teaching human sexuality courses to college students around the country, and I just found that the great equalizer among all students, whether they're in the Ivy League or at a big public institution, is that nobody knows any more about sex than anyone else. And
Right.
so I wanted to kind of take that approach and provide it to a larger audience.
We always say that America, compared to the rest of the world, is kind of puritanical. Is that really true?
Absolutely.
Really?
It's funny that we live in a culture where sex is all around us. We see it everywhere in the media. We see it in advertising. And people from the outside in look at us and think that we're a pretty sexual and open culture. But when you start looking at the way people actually talk about sex, you see that we're very repressed. And we have that puritanical baggage and history that's still dragging on us in a lot of ways.
I'm not in practice anymore. I was in practice for, 12, 15 years. And it's been a long time since I did it. But then when I did, even in the privacy of the therapist room where everything was supposedly protected and people could be frank and honest, people would still get red-faced, dig their toe in the carpet, not want to make eye contact when it came to talking about sex. And if you started talking to them about sexual fantasies, role-playing, any kind of expressing what they were thinking about but not giving a voice, it was like, oh my God. I mean, sometimes you'd bring it up and never see them again.
Right.
They would just never come back. They were just too embarrassed. Why is that in this country? Because it's not that way in France. It's not that way in most of Europe, which is where I've spent a fair amount of time. Why are we that way?
What you're saying reminds me of a point that I make in the book, which is that people find it easier to have sex than to talk about sex.
Oh, absolutely.
And that
Yeah.
is such a big problem. And I think there are lots of fingers that we could point to and blame. And, we can look at the history of the culture in this country. But actually, I think the mental health community has done a lot in terms of stigmatizing a lot of sexual interests that people have. For example, that term paraphilia, which means an unusual sexual interest. We have labeled many, many different desires as paraphilic over the years, which makes people think that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah, right.
If it's unusual, people feel like it's a disorder or a problem. And it turns out that a lot of the things that we've labeled as paraphilias are actually pretty normal sexual interests. That's one of the things I look at in the book. Is it's based on the largest survey of sexual fantasies ever conducted in the United States. And one of the things I find, for example, that we've long thought was rare that's really common is interest in BDSM and power play when it comes to sex. Very common.
Yeah. Well, you talk in the book about the 7 most common fantasies in America. Talk about what some of those are and how common they really are.
Sure. So the first of these is multi-partner sex, which means threesomes, foursomes, or moresomes. And what I found was that more than 90% of men and women of all orientations and backgrounds reported fantasizing about this at some point. The BDSM power and control fantasies were also extraordinarily common, high 80s, low 90% of people fantasizing about it. Some of the other really common fantasies are the novelty and adventure fantasies, where people are taking sex out of their own bed and their own bedroom and just mixing it up and doing something different.
And when you say something different, are you talking about different places in the home or out in public, or what is the fantasy?
So public sex is actually one of the really big ones.
Right.
It's not that people actually want to have sex in public and be seen. They just want that risk or potential thrill of, being caught.
How much do they act on that fantasy?
Not a lot. So a couple of statistics for you. When I asked people about their favorite fantasy of all time, 80% of them said that they want to act on that fantasy in the future, which means it's a desire for them. However, only 1 in 5 people said that they've ever actually done that before. So there's this very big gap between fantasy and reality.
What are some of the others?
Some of the other common fantasy themes are the taboo fantasies. We know that when people are told they can't or shouldn't do something, that makes them come to want to do it even more. So that's where a lot of the fetish sorts of fantasies come in.
Right.
Then there's the passion and romance fantasies, where people are meeting some emotional need, whether it's connecting with a partner or feeling desired or wanted. Then there are the non-monogamy fantasies, where people are thinking about what it would be like to be polyamorous or in an open relationship. And then lastly, there's sort of the gender bending and homoeroticism fantasies where people are sort of pushing the boundaries of their gender role or sexual orientation in some way.
I've had people come on and talk a lot about open marriages.
Mm-hmm.
I have yet to find one that didn't wind up as a train wreck. Have you ever run across a formula that works in an open marriage?
So it can work.
Really? I got to hear this.
So I've actually done a bit of research in the last few years on people who are in different types of open relationships. And really what we see is that people in these relationships can be just as happy as couples who are monogamous, but they aren't always. And I think the really key factor is that a lot of people try to open their marriage as a way of fixing a broken marriage, and that usually never works out well. So the relationship really has to be in a good place first. You have to approach this from a position of strength, and there has to be fantastic communication between the partners, and they have to be on the same page about what they want and clearly establish the rules. And then also recognize that, things might not go exactly according to plan. Maybe we're going to deal with issues like jealousy and so forth, and we have to be willing to communicate openly about them to work through that.
So my formula for a healthy relationship is, if you're going to have a good marriage or just committed relationship, that has to be based on a solid underlying friendship. And then it's a function of how well it meets the needs of the two people involved. So if you and I are in a relationship, it doesn't matter whether it's friends or marriage or whatever. If we're in a relationship and my needs are getting met at a level of 85% and yours are getting met at a level of 10%, then my experience of the relationship is going to be really good and yours is going to be really bad.
Mm-hmm.
But if both of us are having our needs met, and then I say, you've got two jobs. One is to really work actively to learn your partner's needs. And two is to teach actively your partner what your needs are. Then you've got two people working towards each other. I'm working towards you to try and learn your needs and teach you mine, and you're working towards me trying to learn my needs and teach me yours. Then you've got two people working towards each other, learning and teaching each other what their needs are. Then that's the formula for a good relationship. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense to me.
And if that's happening, then needs are being met, then you would ask yourself, then why would you open a relationship and bring in an interloper? And you're right, because when something's wrong, I've said you're never going to fix a relationship by turning away from your partner. But you're saying if everything's working well, that's when you see it work.
It's when it can work. And this is where I think we need to get into the personalities of the individual partners. Open relationships, polyamory, this is not right for everyone. For lots of people, monogamy is great, works out really well. One thing that I often point to as a personality factor that matters is what's called your sociosexual orientation, which is basically the degree to which you see sex and emotion as going together. Some people see them as very much intertwined. For other people, they're separable. And for the people who see those things as different, they are potential candidates for some type of open relationship or marriage because they're less likely to have all of the extra emotional entanglements and complications that are going to arise from bringing a third person or other person in.
So you're saying they don't look at emotion and sex as being intertwined, going hand in hand. They're more likely to be able to successfully have an open marriage.
Yes.
Yeah. I've always wondered how you bring that up. Not that I want to bring it up, in case Robin's listening. I want to make it very clear. But I've always wondered how you bring that up around the table. Because I can tell you at my house, that would get a black eye. If you're sitting around the breakfast table and you say, by the way, what would you think about, I don't know, having sex with other people? I don't think I would get from the E at the end of people to the period at the end of the sentence without getting punched in the face. How do you bring that up? I don't know how that would work.
So that's actually a big part of the book is talking about how do you have these difficult conversations with a partner about your sexual fantasies and desires. And you don't want to do it at the breakfast table,
No.
like when you're catching your partner in a, sort of very, not sexual kind of state. So I talk a lot about how you got to pick the right time and setting to have these conversations. Ideally, you're both kind of in the mood to talk about sex. You've just watched a steamy movie together, for example. It's finding the right icebreaker to have the conversation and then starting low and going very slow. You don't need to get all your adventuresome fantasies out there right away. It's start with the more vanilla side and work up to it as you've built trust and intimacy and communication.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess we have sex and emotion intertwined at our house because Dad just wouldn't play.
And hey, this is one of these things where there's no right answer. Different things work for different people. And it's just finding what best meets the needs of the partners.